Well, good morning, everyone. I apologize for the delay. Good morning, everyone. Apologize for the delay. I had an issue this morning. The microphone just quit working, so apologize for that. We'll get started this morning. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 15. Matthew and chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15 we're going to look at this morning. And I want to back up and remember where we're at, like in the big picture of what's going on in this story. Let's think about what is going on in this story so we can remember where the gospel authors, the people who wrote this book for Matthew, I want us to remember where we're at here. So we're portraying the story of Jesus. And we're portraying the story of Jesus and its meaning for the readers of the gospel. Remember, the gospels were written to people after Christ died. They were written by the apostles. And so here they are portraying Jesus, the story of Jesus, and its meaning for us. This was not written to people who lived before the cross. And so but they were written from a certain perspective. Let's think about that for a second. They were written from the perspective of the apostles, and so they're going to describe the themes that they see happening in Jesus and how he is the fulfillment of the Hebrew Scriptures. And there's two main themes that they're running simultaneous beside each other in the Hebrew Scriptures. And that is, there's God's purpose for all of the families of earth, right? Because when we see Adam and Eve, we don't see Israel. We don't see a specific anybody chosen yet. We see a specific type of being chosen. We see all of the families of earth, God wanting to bless all of them. But even the very first family, Adam and Eve, separate themselves from God because of their own decisions, because of their selfishness. They want that fruit, and so they reach out and they take that fruit for themselves. And that is the story of mankind, whether it is Adam and Eve, whether it is the Tower of Babel, whether it is Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, whether it is the kings of Israel, whether it is the Jews in the first century, or whether it's you and I. We all fight that urge to take what is not ours and make it our own because we want to do it. And so for God to bless those families on earth, all of the families on earth, he has to restore them to a right relationship with him. And he chose one particular family to do that. And so we see this narrowing. Now I have a chart later on that's going to explain this a little bit better, but he chose one particular family to bless all of the families, right? That's the promise that's made to Abraham, that he would bless all of the families, but he would bless all of the nations on earth. But the problem is, the family that he chooses to be a blessing becomes broken and becomes violent and splits apart, just like everyone else in the world does. Every other human in the world does. So solving the broken family of Abraham problem is the way of addressing the broken family problem for all of humanity. Because the Gospels were written for this purpose then. They were to show us how solving the broken problem of Israel would apply to us. They're going to tell the stories of Jesus through the eyes not only of Jewish eyewitnesses, but they're going to tell the story with an eye through the greater role of the gospel repairing all of humanity, or redeeming all of humanity back to that family, that familial relationship with their Creator. And that's where we're at here in Matthew chapter 15. I know that was a big, long, maybe very heady academic type of introduction, but it's important because we frequently, I don't know how many times in my youth, maybe it's just me, how many times in my youth I heard this passages or verses from chapter 15 lifted out and used, just one or two verses, and we don't get the context of what's going on here. The context of what is going on here, let me just give you a spoiler right here. The Pharisees, the Jews, Israel, the one God comes back to repair so that all of humanity can be blessed, those people are rejecting him. But we have that contrasted with the Canaanite woman, the woman who is supposed to be getting the blessing through Israel. And Jesus says, my mission is not to you. The problem is what happens in the story. She gets the blessing. And there's another surprise at the end, but we'll get to that. Let's move on. Because this lesson here is getting a little long and I started a little late, we'll just skip this slide here. If you'd like, you can stop the video and look at it, but these are just some notable things that happen in this chapter. So let's move on right into the chapter. Chapter 15, in verses 1 through about 9. This is Jesus' discourse with the Pharisees. And so let me first say that it cannot be underestimated how important ritual purity was for the Pharisees. Can you double check, make sure the audio is working? It is, okay. It cannot be underestimated how important ritual purity was for the Pharisees. And so, and for the nation of Israel in general, right? If a person was ritually impure, they could not function or be a part of mainstream society, right? And depending on that cause of the impurity, the Levitical law said that they could not worship, they could not eat with, they could not do business with, or they couldn't otherwise closely interact with anyone in the community. And so the accusation here that's being made against Jesus is an important one to understand. They say it's the tradition of the elders. What they're really hinting at, though, is that Jesus is impure. And that is a whole different can of worms than just not washing your hands. And this is an important accusation to understand. So the Pharisees had taken a law that only applied to priests handling the showbread in the temple or the tabernacle. That required washing of your hands before you did that as a priest. And they tried to bind that onto everyone as a matter of law. And see, the weird thing is, Jesus never even addresses this issue with the Pharisees directly, does he? Because by the end of the section here, the Pharisees have left because they're mad, and Peter asks, "Can you explain this parable to us?" Just like Jesus had explained the other parables in a separate setting previously. So Jesus turns and he explains the parable to them. But he never even replies to the washing of hands argument that the Pharisees are making. Not to them anyway. He replies to the disciples. And so the accusation that was made against Jesus was that he had transgressed the tradition of the elders, that he was impure. But Jesus turns that around back on them and says that they are impure because of this historical little thing that happens, and it needs a little bit of explanation because there isn't a good explanation of it here in the Bible. And what was going on, and we know from writings of the time, was that you could donate a piece of land or a piece of property, whatever it was, to the temple, and the temple would officially take possession of it. But in some cases, it would still be in the temple courtyard, where you could have access to it and make money from it, whatever it was, if it was a table or whether it was food or something you were going to sell, and you could still have access to it. And so you could say to your parents, "Oh, I don't have any money. See, there's nothing on my books. I don't own anything. I gave it all to the temple." And then you could go to the temple and still use it. In the case of land, you could say, "Oh, I donate my land to the temple." So the temple officially owns it, but if you were in good with one of the rabbis, they would still let you farm it and make money off of that. But officially, you didn't own any land. So you had no duty to anybody, right? Yeah. It was a game of fraud is what it was. And so when Jesus replies to the Pharisees, he uses a counterintuitive example for us because we may not understand the context of what was going on. But he makes a more serious charge that they themselves are impure. That the people who claim to be the most pure ones in all of Israel are impure in their hearts, on the inside, where it actually matters. And so, in verse 11, we get to the explanation that he gives, not to the Pharisees themselves, but to the crowd. Now, the Pharisees hear this, what happens. This is not a secret from the Pharisees at this point. But what is the bigger picture of what's going on here? The story of the Pharisees is that you have this group that craves power. And now they even want to reach into the heavens and create a new law for mankind. Does this sound familiar? Sounds like the Tower of Babel. They want to reach into heaven so that they can become like God. The Pharisees wanted to become like God, and they were drunk with this power of ruling over the people. But Jesus foreshadows a time when the great moral impurity in their heart, in all of humanity's heart, is going to be dealt with. And so Jesus, he makes this pronouncement. He pronounces that nothing that goes into the mouth can defile you, can make you impure. And that was in direct contradiction to the Levitical law. Let's not pull any punches. Let's not try and rationalize it. This was in direct contradiction to the Levitical law. But this is not, Jesus isn't suddenly declaring that you don't have to follow the food laws anymore. Now, if you read the bottom of the slide there, it's a different version of that story over in Mark. Because Mark says, "Thus he said, cleansing all meats." Now this is not a literal translation there of the word for food, but the word for meats is food there. So some versions say, in fact, the New American Standard here that I have in my hand, let me just turn over there real quick, Mark chapter 7, verse 19. New American Standard says, "Thus he declared all foods clean." Now, if you have the King James or the New King James, these words are still in red because the authors thought that these were Jesus' words. Every other major translation out there disagrees with that and says that this saying was a comment that Mark put in there. And so you'll see some really weird things that try to happen in the King James and the New King James to rectify that. But the point here is that Jesus was emphasizing something that was true in the present, but that wouldn't come to fulfillment fully until the future. So Jesus pronounces that nothing that comes into the mouth, that's food, no food can defile you. But this was intended to be understood as an idiomatic phrase, especially as a Hebrew idiom, and I've already mentioned it in Bible class, Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, where God says, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice." Did God invalidate the sacrificial system during Hosea's day? No, that's not what's going on here. The emphasis is on the positive element, right? He's not rejecting the latter element. The emphasis is on the positive element over some other element. So when Jesus says these things, he's emphasizing the positive element. The fact that nothing going into the mouth can defile you, but it is your actions that defile you. If you murder somebody, there's a whole list of things, right, that could defile you. In verse 19, for out of the heart comes evil thoughts and murders and adulteries and fornications and theft and false witness and slander. So this little event here is showing us the priority of internal purity in relation to how I treat my brother over the purpose of ritual religion or ritual sacrifice. That's all it's showing. And so this little event here in Matthew records for us a very important step on how the gospel writers were going to portray the bringing in, the admission of the Gentiles to the church. See, the admission of the Gentiles was a very controversial thing in the first century. And it hinged on personal decisions of how Christians believed and what they believed about religious purity. Right? Because the primary audience initially was Jewish, and so they would have viewed things through the eyes of purity. And so if I see this person who is impure because he's not circumcised, because he eats pork, because he does these things, he can't come into being with me and with God if he's still impure. Matthew is foreshadowing the time when these things would no longer be law. And Mark comes out right out and says it. He says, thus cleansing all meats. But Matthew makes the same argument here by saying, nothing that comes into the mouth could defile you. Nothing can make you impure. And so Christians had to decide, was this person who ate pork, was he my brother in Christ? And the answer that Jesus gives is unequivocally, yes, he is your brother. And so Jesus' statement here in verse 11, when he says, not what enters into the mouth defiles the man, but what proceeds out of the mouth that defiles the man. When he says that, he calls into question not only the priestly purity laws, but all of the whole ritual system in the temple, right? This is not a setting aside of the law. He's not saying, oh, well, this is not the law anymore. I come and this is going to be different from now on. That's not what he's doing. Mark's comment and Matthew's comment here that he records of Jesus is intended for a purpose. Remember, the readers are first century Christians. And so this is a good example of a word that was addressed to the Christian reader of the gospel that was a foreshadowing of something that was to come. It's a commentary for the reader of the gospel from the future, right? Because Matthew is writing this at some point in the future. He's not writing this as it's happening. And so this represents, especially Mark's saying here, represents this interpretation, Mark's interpretation of the word, and an explanation for what Jesus was saying. But let's back up even further. This is really just an academic discussion, right? The Gospels were written for Christians. It doesn't matter whether or not Jesus got rid of the food laws at this point or not, because this was written for Christians who were already living after the cross, after the food laws were gone. The Gospels were written to Christians, and so the letters were written to Christians. They were written for the same purpose by the same people, is my point here. And so let's move on to the next story. We have this Canaanite woman here. She is, well, let me back up. Big picture here again. Jesus has this laser-like focus, right, on the family of Israel. His own people, right? His own family, blood family. But starting in verse 21, we see a familiar story for us who've grown up in the church, right? It's a familiar story. A woman comes to Jesus to plead that he would heal her and heal her daughter, demon-possessed daughter. But she's not an Israelite. She's a Canaanite. And right here, I want you to draw a line, and I want you to shut your brain off. I want you to shut off all of the previous assumptions that you've made, and let the text of the Word of God here speak to you, because we often import in our previous knowledge, and it often causes what's called confirmation bias. We only confirm what we already believe. We don't actually learn anything new. So let's learn something new. Look at the text with a fresh eye here. This time Jesus is going to do something unfamiliar, right? Because in all these other cases, he's healed the people, no questions. He's healed them, and he's healed them, and he's healed them until he is exhausted and he has to run away to the other side of the lake. And there's people waiting there. And so he heals them, and he heals them until he just can't take it anymore. And he runs up onto a mountain. And I want us to look at what's going on, because he's refusing to heal, right? It's not because he can't heal. It's not because he can't do it, but because he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And if we take that and we draw this dark line, she should never have been healed. And I said this during the Bible class. If you are comfortable with what you believe about Jesus and his purpose, don't read the Bible. Because the Bible will break your categories. You will think you have everything in these nice little square boxes, and suddenly you get a sphere, and it doesn't go into the box. And so we really need to back up and accept that this is Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, the King, who is doing these actions, and because they don't fit into my box, does not mean that I have the right to say, well, this really means something else. You know, he only did it because he wanted to. This doesn't mean that, he wasn't giving the same thing that he gave to Israel, to the Gentiles, because he did. That's what he did. He healed her just like he healed everyone else. And so I want to contrast what he said, that he was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I want to contrast that with the ending of chapter 12. What does it say at the end of chapter 12 here? While he was still speaking to the multitudes, behold, his mother and his brothers were standing outside. His literal family, literal Israel, was standing outside the door. And what does he do? Behold, they were standing outside seeking to speak to him. And someone said to him, behold, your mother and your brothers are standing outside seeking to speak with you. And he answered them and said, who is my brother and who are my mother? Who is my mother and who is my brothers? And stretching out his hand towards his disciples, he said, behold, my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he is my brother and sister and mother. Jesus' mother and brothers have come to visit him, and he just dismisses them. And he says, whoever does the will of my Father in heaven, he is my brother and sister and mother, right? Right from the beginning of the Jesus movement, right, there was a redefinition of what family was. And Jesus had a very expansive definition of that, and a very non-traditional view of the family. And we like to think that only literal physical Israel was part of the family at this part of the juncture. And I would agree that that's what Jesus was focused on. But this story portrays something different. And I don't know how to tell you to understand that, but I'm going to tell you that Jesus does the same thing for this woman and for a lot of other people who are Gentiles that he does for Israel. And so he initially dismisses her. Remember, the story of the Gospels here, the story of the Gospel is being written by an author who already knows the ending. He already knows the ending. He knows that Jesus has defeated death, and having proven that he is the true Israelite and that he will bless all of the nations, Matthew knows all these things, and so he gives us hints in these stories of how that is going to come in the future, until that final announcement of a shift to the message to all people, to all the nations, in chapter 28 and verse 29. Of course, the famous go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Okay, so back to our, Matthew knows the ending, but he's giving us hints of that in the Syro-Phoenician woman, or the Canaanite woman here, and he's giving us a hint of what's going to happen in the future. So this it's a foretaste, it's a foreshadowing of what was going to come. And that foreshadowing was that the healing gospel message that Jesus was bringing to Israel would be available to even her too. What is Jesus' whole purpose here? What has he been doing since chapter 4? Proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, healing every kind of sickness among them. And the news about him went into all Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill with various diseases and pains and blah, and etc., and etc. It's chapter 4, verse 23. From that time forward, he came proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, that the kingdom of God was at hand. Chapter 4 and verse 17. This message was available to this woman also. And so, let's look at the setting of the story first. I want to get into how this story fulfills a certain prophecy in Isaiah. But I want to first set the scene for the story. So the setting of the story is in Tyre and Sidon. I don't have my map up anymore, sorry. But Tyre and Sidon is in the northwest. It is northwest of the Sea of Galilee. It is on the coast of the Mediterranean. It is more northward than the nation of Israel has ever, the borders have ever been. They've never taken Tyre and Sidon, for sure not Sidon. And so this is thoroughly non-Jewish areas. Tyre and Sidon were major ports that all of the spices from the Far East would come down the Silk Road from Afghanistan, all those places, all the way to the Mediterranean. They would be loaded onto boats there and then sailed over to Rome and other places. So this was a very rich port that had a lot of different people from a lot of different places in the world. There were not a lot of Jews in these areas. These were not Jewish cities. So what on earth is going on here? Why is he in Tyre? Why is he in Sidon? Why does he have to go to this area? Verse 21. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman came from that region, came out and began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." Why is he in this area? It's because he's been rejected by his own people, by Israel. Every time there's a conflict, every time the Pharisees have come, he removes himself. He withdraws himself. So he goes to another area. And historically, Tyre and Sidon has been enemies for the most part. There's a few times that they were allies. They have been enemies of Israel and Judah. So what happens when he goes there? He doesn't just happen along this woman, right? What does this woman do? A woman from this region came out and began crying out. She knew he was coming, and she sought him out. So he meets this person that's specifically called the Canaanite woman, right? The historical arch nemesis of Israel. Israel comes to the land of Canaan and dispossesses the people. That's the nice word instead of slaughtering, right? That's the nice word. It is dispossesses these people. How do you think these people viewed Israel? These were people who were slaughtered by Israel as a judgment from God on them. Why were they slaughtered? Well, if we read Joshua and Judges, we read that the Canaanites had a system, especially their economic system, that was unjust. It benefited a few people at the expense of the many. They were under God's judgment for sexual misconduct, horrible, awful sexual misconduct, and especially for the practice of child sacrifice. And all these things, the sexual misconduct, the oppressive economic system, and the child sacrifice was woven into the fabric of these people and the culture in Canaan. If we can imagine the most racially charged moment of our life, I know we live in Alaska and there's not a lot of conflict here necessarily racially. There is on a very passive-aggressive level, but not like if you were in downtown in a big city down south. And so, if you can imagine the most racially charged moment of your life, or maybe a Hollywood movie, this is it, right? The Jewish Messiah is in a Gentile city, and a Canaanite woman approaches him, and what does she call him? She calls him Master. She calls him Lord. She calls him Son of David. These are royal terms. This is how you address a king of Israel. This is not what we would expect from this woman. But Jesus refuses. Why does he refuse? He's run into Gentiles previously, right? I mean, the Roman centurion, right? He healed their servant. The Roman centurion, who is the symbol of oppression and evil, the symbol of onerous taxation to the point to where you have to sell your property, and then you sell yourself as a slave to work on your own property to some faraway Roman who's been given the land. And he heals that person's son or servant. Sorry. Why would he heal the Roman? Sorry, I'm getting my terms mixed up. Why would he heal the Roman and not heal her and her daughter? Jesus is simply being faithful to God's promises to all of mankind. Remember, Jesus wants to bless all of mankind through Israel and through the people of Israel. But his own people have rejected him. Let's take this metaphor one step further, because I want to take one more step down the rabbit hole. Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 2, and I'm going to read a little bit from Isaiah chapter 2. Because this is, you have to remember, when the gospel writers are writing these things, this is what they have on their brain. They don't have Twitter on their brain. They don't have Facebook melting their brain into a pile of mush. They have these things on their brain. Isaiah in chapter 2. Starting in verse 1. The word which Isaiah, the son of Amos, Isha ben Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it will come about in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and the nations, that's the word for Gentiles there, and the nations will stream to it. This is the foundational image of the book of Isaiah, right here. He's going to refer back to this day of the Lord, numerous times. It's going to come to a point at the second half of the chapter when the servant of the Lord is coming to bring his people back to God so they can celebrate at this mountain of the Lord. And what do we call the servant? We call the servant the suffering servant, because he's rejected. And all the nations will stream to it, this mountain. And many peoples will come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, that's the mountain of the Lord, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. What is Jesus also called? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And he will judge between the nations. That's the same word for Gentiles. And will render decisions for many peoples. They're looking for Isaiah is looking for justice. The kings of Israel had no justice. So he's looking for a just God, a just Messiah, a just leader who's going to come and actually live by God's rules. Live by the principles of mercy that God wanted, the love of God. And he will judge between the nations, and he will render decisions for many peoples, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. And nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. Come, O house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. House of Jacob? What's Jacob's other name? Israel. I thought this was to Judah. Verse 1. He's equivocating the family of God here, and he's inviting them to the mountain of the Lord, just like he's inviting these other nations around him. And you might have heard that line about these beating plowshares into swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. What's that about, right? Well, if we had a modern day equivalent, we might call it, beating their AK-47s into ambulance parts. The idea here is that they're turning implements of war into items that sustain life. They're turning a sword into a plow so that they can sustain life, because God is the life giver. And so when Jesus comes, he comes to give life. And so God is going to come and bring a message that is totally and completely other, totally and completely different from the way of mankind, which is war. And it's a transformation of the world as the way, from the way that you and I know it, and it's a transformation into a place of justice instead of tragedy, instead of injustice, instead of war. That's how we know the world. It's going to be transformed. The world is going to be transformed into a place of peace, not only between man to man, but peace with God. And just a few chapters later here, Isaiah is going to look back on this day, and he's going to say this. He's going to say, chapter 11 and verse 10. Then it will come about in that day. That's the same day we were just talking about. Then it will come about in that day that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse. Who will stand as a signal or as a banner, some versions say, to all the peoples. And his resting place will be glorious. How is this going to happen? How are all these nations going to flow to Israel? In the last poem that we just read, Isaiah says that something was going to happen in Jerusalem, right? At the mount of God's temple, and it was going to be different, right? The mountain of God's temple, right, was going to be different. But they already had a temple. How is it going to be different? Well, let's look at the poetry here of chapter 11. In that day, the nations will resort to the root of not to David, but to the root of what David was intended to be. Instead of grafting off of David, taking a part of David and being like David, we're going to start all over from the ground up. That's what the metaphor is. From the root is going to spring up. And so we have this vivid image of starting over, not just from David, but from the ground up of a new life-giving tree, or a life-giving sort of pole, flagpole here, that's springing up from the ground, and it grows and grows and it grows. It has this banner on it so that everyone in the whole world can see it, and it's now a symbol of food and peace and righteousness. That's the imagery here that we're getting from this poetry. And so we can see that this poem is inviting us into the very heartbeat of what the storyline of the Bible is all about. And that is, God's focus has always been on mankind, and all of mankind, not just Israel, bringing them back to himself. And so this poem is about God bringing justice and goodness to all nations. They all come equally to the mountain of the Lord, to the root of Jesse, so that when a carpenter's son from the line of David starts saying things like, the kingdom of God is among you. All right, Luke chapter 17, verse 21. The kingdom of God is among you, like right now. Jesus was saying that the kingdom of God came in himself and in his actions. He was the tree that was growing up so that all the world could see. He is literally doing the things that are embodied in this poetry. Do you see that? And so he is fulfilling their hopes and their dreams right in front of their eyes. And everyone is just thrilled, right? Did we read the first half of chapter 15? Because that's not what happened, right? They're not so thrilled. Now they're going to come all the way from Jerusalem, that should be waving the flag of the banner. They're going to come all the way from Jerusalem to pick a fight with him because they're afraid of him. Why are they afraid of him? Because he is the true Israel. He is not a power structure as a means of controlling the people. That's what the Pharisees were, sitting in the seat of Moses. He is not a power structure as a means of controlling the people to enrich yourself. He is the way, the truth, and the light, the way to God. He is the Word of God. Jesus is different. And so here's how the story of the Bible works. And the reason I'm getting this, it seems like I'm getting far off track, but I promise you I'm going to tie this all together. Because here's how the story of the Bible works, right? All of humanity, all of the nations, starting from the first family, Adam and Eve, they all rebel from God, and they declare their own independence, their own autonomy. And they decide to build a world that is in their own image. Right? God says he creates man in his image, and he wants to cultivate that image and that relationship with them in the garden. See the pun there? Cultivate. He wants to cultivate that relationship together, but instead they choose to break that relationship. And they take what doesn't belong to them. They choose to take of it themselves. So all humanity, all nations, rebel from God, and they declare their autonomy, their selfishness, and they decide to build the world their own way. The most obvious version of this is Babel, right? We know how that turned out. But can we just look out our window right now? And this is the metaphorical window. It's not the one right here. Can we look out the window and look in different cities and see what's going on? What's going on in D.C. right now? This is people who want independence and authority to make their own decisions, and so they're willing to kill other people to do it. God's response to that rebellion is to choose one family out of the nations, and he made them a channel. He made them a conduit that the blessings would flow through, that he would use this family to restore his relationship to all of the nations. And this family would be a city on a hill, right? We just saw that. A community that is in contrast to all of the other nations. A light to all of those other nations. Totally different, transformed. They're going to live in justice and righteousness. And what did Israel do with all of that privilege and responsibility? They failed, just like all the other humans that came before them. This sounds like a very sad story with hopelessness. But we have to realize where we're at in that hopelessness before we can realize how great a king that God gives us is. God gives them a king. Now, he gave them a physical king. And how did he do? Well, the first couple of years were pretty good. Till he sees a naked woman and he wants her. And so he takes what does not belong to him and he forces himself on her. He gets her pregnant and murders her husband. And we think to ourselves, where have I just read this? It's in all the history of humanity. Because the great King David himself does the same evil that all of mankind has done before him. And so God is committed to redeeming and restoring this world that has rebelled against him, and he's committed to doing that through human beings. This is why Christ had to be human when he came. Fully human and fully God. But the whole storyline here comes to this point where no one has done it. Look at the chart. No one on the left side of the chart has done it. Right? It is working behind me, right? No one has done it. So, no one has redeemed and restored the nations back to God. And so with that bigger picture in mind now, we get to the point where we have some questions. We have these questions, and they seem so insignificant now that we have the big story in mind, right? The question is, did Jesus come to deal with the political and economic situation in Israel? Seems so insignificant when we look at the big storyline here. Did Jesus come to deal with the political or economic system in Washington, D.C.? No, he didn't. He came to change hearts. And that's the whole point of Isaiah chapter 2. That's the whole point of Jesus' story with the Pharisees. He didn't come to change the Pharisaical system. That's not what he came to do. He didn't come to say the Sadducees are right, you Pharisees are wrong. That's not what he came to do. He came to change hearts. He came to purify from the inside out. God's redemption is flowing out from the Mount of Zion, from this banner that's flying in the tree, in this great tree, is flowing out to all the nations. And that's where the story ends, right? Because we know Matthew knows the ending. But right at this moment in chapter 15 of Matthew, Jesus hasn't moved on from his mission to Israel yet. The problem here is in verse 28. Let's read verse 28 of chapter 15. Then Jesus answered and said to her, O woman, your faith is great. Be it done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed from that hour, or at once. Depends on your translation. If the problem was that the principle here was that no dogs ever got bread from the table, then Jesus would not have healed this woman. He would not have healed the centurion's family, or had Gentile blood in his heritage. There were at least 4 women in his heritage, his lineage, that had Gentile blood. Jesus sees this as a teaching moment for everyone involved, and so does Matthew. That's why he records it for us. Jesus' refusal to heal her daughter draws out a response of faith that is a testimony in front of the disciples. Because what are the disciples? Let me just read this story real quick. She says, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." But he did not answer her a word, and his disciples came to him and kept asking him, saying, "Send her away, for she is shouting after us." But he answered and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Done. We don't heal Gentiles. Is that what happened? That's not what happened. But she came and began to bow down before him. So, let's get a vision of what's going on here. She's chasing behind him. She has come out of her own. She is chasing this man down the road. She now goes from chase mode to full-on confrontation mode by getting in front of him and not allowing him to pass. She began to bow down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered and said, "It is not good to take of the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." That doesn't sound like the Jesus that we've seen so far. What's going on here? There's something different going on here. Jesus is seeing the teaching moment here. And this woman, who is a Gentile, who has nothing to do with these people because our peoples hate each other, remember, racially charged moment, this woman calls Jesus the Jewish Messiah and her Lord, and Lord, by extension, Lord of the Canaanites. Wait, what? By calling him Lord, she's saying that he is her Lord, but she's not a Jew. She's not an Israelite. So the moment that Jesus sees her confidence and sees her true heart, his trust, her trust in him for who that he says he is, what does he do? But she said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from the master's table." And Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman." I'm glad this translation, the New American Standard, has it, because that O is in the Greek. It's an emphasis. "O woman, your faith is great. Be it done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed at once. What was the sign? The signs, plural, that John the Baptist should have recognized that the kingdom was at hand. What were the signs? Signs were healing of the blind, the deaf hear, demons. I mean, these are things that are signs of a king, of a Messiah coming. And he does them for Gentiles. This story breaks open our categories a little bit, because he says he's only coming to the lost sheep, and he said this previously also to the limited commission, right, before he sends them out. Don't go to Don't go to only go to Israel. And then where do they head? Well, Jesus happens to go right through Samaria. And so Jesus leaves. This story is nothing short of brilliance, both on Jesus' part and Matthew, how he puts this story immediately after what happens here with the Pharisees and how he writes it. The moment Jesus sees her confidence, right? Her trust in him as that he is who he says he is. Boom! Jesus opens the kingdom of heaven to her. This is what he says he's doing in chapter 4. And he opens it to many other Gentiles too, because let's look at what follows in verse 31. So the multitude marveled as they saw the dumb speaking. This is after Jesus' healing here, because Jesus departs from where she's at, and he goes along the Sea of Galilee. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us whereabouts on the Sea of Galilee, but Mark does. Mark tells us that he's in the region of Decapolis. That's on the east side. That's like across the tracks, bad side. Because that was not Israel's territory at the time here. Historically, at one point it had been, but it was not now, and there was not a large Jewish population in this area either. So when Jesus goes to the east side of the lake, to the Decapolis region, and he's healing people, who is he healing? Well, by extension, we know that these are Gentiles. So Jesus is opening the kingdom to her, and he's opening it to other Gentiles because he's healing them and doing the same things for them that he's doing for Israel. Healing the crippled, the lame walking, the blind seeing. These are signs of the Messiah, that they would glorify the God of Israel. Let's look at how all this fits together. There's the Pharisees, the Canaanite woman, the healings and the feedings. This is really nothing short of brilliance. Jesus, he's leaving this Gentile territory. He heads to the east side. Remember, he's been in this territory before. This was the one with all the Gentiles and pigs from chapter 8. Remember when he cast out the demon out of the men into the pigs? Well, let me just read the whole. I should have just read 29, 30, and 31. Let me just read them here. And departing from there, Jesus went along by the Sea of Galilee, and having gone up from the mountain, he was sitting there, and great multitudes came to him, bringing with them those who were lame, and crippled, and blind, and dumb, and many others, and they laid him down at his feet, and he healed them. So that the multitude marveled as they saw the dumb speaking, the crippled restored, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Why would they have to glorify the God of Israel? Well, it was the God that did it. But they might want to describe which God it was, because these people believed in other gods. Especially if it was a pagan area, Matthew would need to tell us that it was this God they were praising. Because if you're in a group of Gentiles and they're praising God, you got to say which one it is, right? So Jesus goes to this region, the non-Jewish side of the lake, and there's bread for everyone. Well, healing for everyone, right? Because remember our metaphor of the woman, the Canaanite woman, even the bread. Even the dog gets the crumbs of the bread. Well, Jesus gives her some of that bread, metaphorically. Jesus gives this crowd some of that metaphorical bread, that spiritual bread also, because he is the bread of life. By healing these people, now he's going to give them physical bread. Does this give us deja vu? Anybody? He's healing everyone. and then there's bread that comes next. This just happened in chapter 14, right? It just happened. This is like in the series of events. Matthew is very chronological generally. This has just happened weeks or months before. This is not something that is ancient history that they would have forgotten. So why would the disciples think that there was no way that Jesus would heal these people? It's because they're Gentiles. And so Matthew is trying to tell us in these stories something. What is he trying to tell us? He's trying to tell us that Jesus, he does have this laser-like focus on his mission to Israel. And I mentioned this in the Bible class that I heard a teacher once say to me that if you are comfortable with what you believe in Jesus, you probably shouldn't read the Bible, because reading the Bible is going to break your categories. There's things in the Bible that don't fit nice and neat into the little box that I have created for Jesus, because Jesus doesn't fit into a box. Jesus has the authority to do what he wants to do here, and he proves it by healing the Gentiles. So what Matthew is trying to tell us in these things is that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, but yet here is a Canaanite woman who will not take no for an answer. And he just kind of leaves it there. He just kind of leaves it there. He doesn't, go into a long discourse telling us what these stories mean. But he does tell us what they mean, and Jesus tells us what they mean, because he's doing the same things for them, the Gentiles, that he was doing for Israel. He was healing the sick, the lame, the blind, the dumb, the mute. The same signs that were signs of the Messiah to John, Jesus is doing for these Gentiles. And this woman won't take no for an answer until Jesus brings some of that future bread of the kingdom of God and gives it to her. And Matthew wants to present this woman as a model of true faith in Jesus, as contrasted with their own people of Israel, the Pharisees, right? This woman hears that Jesus is in town, and she chases him down, literally. And she won't take no for an answer, and she eventually not only chases him, but gets in front of him and blocks him. She will not take no for an answer. And Matthew is saying to his readers that the people I'm writing to, I want them to know that this is how a disciple of Jesus should act, even though she's a Gentile. That we need to have the tenacity to cling to him, because he is the salvation of Israel. He is the salvation of all of humanity. And this is how you need to act, like this woman. And so the main thrust of what the Bible presents is that all of creation, especially humanity, is this family that is under God. And that doesn't mean that we're all going to be the same, right? We tried sameness at the Tower of Babel, right? Everybody was going to speak the same. We're all going to believe the same. Everybody's going to do the same thing. And that didn't work out, right? It failed miserably because they were all chasing after what humanity loves so dearly. Power. They wanted to be like God. They wanted power that benefited themselves. And so selfishly, they wanted to reach up and take it for themselves, what rightly belonged to God. And so this is also the story, not only of Adam and Eve, of the Tower of Babel, but of the kings of Israel. They only made it through 3 kings before the kingdom was divided. That should be obvious to us that it's a failure. The 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are just books of all of the failures of the kings of Israel, because of the power-hungry actions of those kings and of the ruling parties. And Solomon, in all of his glory and splendor, why did he have so much money? Because he taxed the people into rebellion against him. That's what happened. his own son Rehoboam wanted even more than he wanted, and so the kingdom finally broke. So this is also the story. So we have Adam and Eve, we have Babel, we have Abraham trying to sell his wife as his sister, not once, but twice. Abraham, the one who's chosen, right? This is supposed to be the great upright person. Then we have the chosen family. God chooses this family of Jacob, of Israel. And that fails, and the kings fail. But this is also the story of the Pharisees, who crave power and even wanted to reach into the heavens themselves and create new and evil laws for Israel to keep themselves in power, so that they can then abuse that power to make themselves fat. And so they have to reject the Messiah, Jesus, to keep this power structure in place, right? But Jesus and Matthew are foreshadowing a time when that great impurity that Jesus says that is in your heart, that impurity will be addressed, that justice will come, and righteousness will be available. This is the story of a Canaanite woman who Jesus was looking to change the hearts of Israel, but here this woman whose heart was already in the right place comes and acts like a true disciple, craving, longing for what only Jesus can deliver, healing, and so he opens the kingdom to her. And this is the story of you and me, who, like the people by the lake, the Gentiles, that's you and me, long for a healing in this life, for the brokenness that is in Washington, D.C., for the brokenness that is in our community, politically, spiritually, and maybe even physically. Maybe our own bodies are not working like they are supposed to be, just like these people. We long for a healing for our bodies. And so this is the story of Jesus, who came to do for Israel and all nations what we could never do for ourselves. The thing he did for us was to represent our failures. To take those failures on himself, like David's failures, like Israel's failures, and ultimately all of humanity's failures, to take them onto himself and take the consequences of those actions on to himself, to take the consequences of evil and sin and selfishness, and he was going to take them into himself, and he would allow them to overcome him until he died under that load. And his resurrection from the dead gives us something that we could never generate ourselves. So we could never hold the burden of our sin, but not only that, we could never generate life for ourselves. Jesus is life. He is the bread of life. He is victory over death, victory over demons in our own lives, victory over spiritual evil. He is a transformed life. He is the mountain of the Lord that we need to go to, that hopes for a new Jerusalem, for a new mountain, a new heavens and a new earth. And if you'll notice, at the end of Revelation, when it describes the new Jerusalem, there's not a temple. Why do we need a temple? Well, the temple represented the meeting place between God and man. What Jesus offers is a transformed life that hopes for a new Jerusalem, for a new heavens, and a new earth, where the dwelling place of God is with man. And he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. It's It's Revelation 21. Life can only be found by feasting on the bread of life that is Jesus the Messiah. Please come and make him the Messiah over your life today. That is the lesson from Matthew chapter 15 here. We'll be studying Matthew chapter 16. I'm glad that everyone here could join us this morning. Have a good day.